Hey gang, welcome to the whole product thinking, measure and analyzing session. So, last time we looked at whole product thinking across a variety of spectrum and did a bunch of activities. Today we're just going to zero in just on measuring and analysis of that measurement and how it can drive better whole product thinking, kind of considering the entire product. To recap last time, my name's Artie. Feel free to reach out to me whenever you feel like it. And last time we talked about a handful of things. It started with the difference between invention and innovation. And we started with the idea that inventions are new things, innovations are new things that change underlying business models. And a story that we talked about was the story of the invention of the Swiffer and how originally the goal was to improve the mop, and engineers in a lab just built stronger and stronger chemicals to do cleaning for the mop, but never really understood what users were doing with the mops. And it wasn't until a design firm went out into the field and actually interviewed people and watched them mop before they realized, aha, the answer isn't a better mop, the answer is the Swiffer, and thus created a huge industry for P&G. We looked at specifically how that process works in what we call the design process, where we start off with a problem, which when our example of our mop to Swiffer process would be, hey, the problem is mops suck, how can we improve them? And typically, engineers of a variety of sorts, including developers, tend to just think about the problem and not really try to understand the users underneath the problem. And so we looked at last time, instead zeroing in on these three components, which is really understanding through empathy what people are experiencing and why they're having the problem that they're having. And then in the process, typically that will redefine the problem that was originally given to us. And then we ideate on top of that redefinition in order to then create a prototype and then test it. So you may recall that we talked about, hey, a lot of times the problem is this, there's an iceberg up ahead. And we do some mind meld with our users, and specifically the type of users that we want to look at along a continuum of users is the ones at the outliers, the ones on the outer edges, because they're the ones that are encountering the problems the most or have overcome problems the best. And after all that empathy work, we come back with stories, intuition, and data, and the synthesis of those things allow us to look at the problem as originally defined and realize really the problem isn't way up at the top, the problem is really down deeper. And in that process, we redefine the problem, and then we ideate on top of that. And then we build prototypes. And that's where we left off last time, was that we designed a whole bunch of different potential solutions to problems that we had encountered. We interviewed consumers and stakeholders to really understand the problems that they're having and try to really understand the problem that we're trying to solve, what's the thing below the surface. And we built some stuff. We continue to build stuff. But that's not where we end, because what we have to do is then look at what we built and measure and analyze it. Now, to do measure and analysis properly, we really have to seek after insight. And if we just have a bunch of data, that doesn't really get us anywhere. We have to accumulate that data into a way that makes sense. And I like to think of it like this, that the purpose of data is to be visualized, and the purpose of visualization is insight, not pictures. We're not trying to make something pretty to show people to try to drive what the next step should be. What we're trying to do is drive insight and derive insight. The granddaddy of all data visualization is this guy named Edward Tufte. He wrote in the 80s a series of books that were all about data visualization. And what I want to do before we get into the specific needs of measure and analyze around building digital products, I want to look at, really, if the goal is insight that's derived from visualization of data, if that's the goal that then can drive better product development, what really is the very best visualization we could come up with? What is the best that humans have ever come up with when it comes to data visualization? So if we look to Edward Tufte, who's the guy that just studies, and this is all he lives for, is data visualization, and ask him what's the best graphic, he wrote in this book, the graphic I'm about to show you is the best statistical graphic ever drawn. This is the expert of the expert of the expert saying that this is the best one that he's ever seen. And so let's take a look at it. This is a map of Napoleon's invasion of Moscow, or rather attempted invasion of Moscow. It is incredibly insightful. It's incredibly multivariate. There you can see, as we'll see in a minute, there's data all over the place. But before we actually dive into it, let me look at the 20,000 foot view of what this is. So this is a map, and on the left-hand side, you can see the edge of Poland, and on the right-hand side, you can see in the top right, Moscow. And you can see the top line, which is the brown one, begins, the thickness of the line indicates how many troops Napoleon had underneath him. And you can see here he starts out with a little over 400,000 troops. And by the time he gets to Moscow, he has around 100,000 troops. And then the black line is him retreating from Moscow. Now let's zoom in on some of these details and really try to understand why this is the best statistical graphic in the history of statistical graphics. So let's look in at right as Napoleon is leaving Poland. You can see again starts with about 400,000 troops. And as he goes, he slowly loses troops as they're marching. We're now less than half of that. And when he encounters things like rivers, that kills a lot of guys. We dropped 27,000 people just by crossing this one river. Then we hit Moscow, and we have a fourth of the troops that we had before. Now you may be wondering, hey, guys are just walking. How did you lose that many people in that amount of time? The reason, and really the moral of the story is don't try to invade Moscow in the winter, is because the temperature was dropping. Napoleon decided to try to do this during winter. And so that many guys froze to death on their way to Moscow. Now, this is where the story gets really grim. Let's look at what happened on the retreat from Moscow. In this graphic, along with the map itself that shows you the width of the number of troops, along the bottom we also have the temperature. And you can see that the temperature drops over time, and when it drops, we lose troops. So let's look at this one right here. You can see here that we lost about 25% of our troops in one temperature drop. Again, another. And when you cross rivers, again, huge drop. And even regaining some guys that had tried to go around Moscow rejoined with the retreat. We had a huge bump up in our forces. But we cross a river combined with a temperature drop, and we lose half of them. And that's how you come back with 10,000 troops when you leave with 400,000 troops. This statistical graphic is incredibly insightful. Look at the two areas that are circled. Look how much smaller the small one is than the big one. It's a bad idea to try to invade Moscow. But also think about what is underneath this visualization. This insight that we gained is not just random, it's from the underlying data. And by capturing this data and organizing it in a way that makes sense to consumers, Menard, who's the one to design that graphic, is able to generate insight, which then from that insight, we can generate a solution. In our case, don't invade Moscow in the winter. So let's look at how we actually go about gathering data and what it can tell us. There's a nice little book called The Back of the Napkin, which I think is really helpful around this kind of stuff. And it talks about the 4 phases of understanding data and then turning around and communicating that out to people. The first is to look. Okay, so we have a bunch of stuff. Let's look at it. And then once we look at it, we can organize it. In other words, we see it. Now, the difference between looking and seeing, and then we go on to imagine what's possible, and then we go and show people what we think and try to convince them to move in the way that we want to go. But really, 1 and 2, I think, is an important distinction. The distinction between looking at data and seeing data. Seeing what's really happening. Because we can collect data all we want. In fact, right now, there are logs on all of your servers that are collecting tons and tons of data. That's not the important part. That's happening. The important part is seeing it. And to understand the distinction between those two, I just want to tell a quick story about a guy named John Snow. Not this John Snow, but this John Snow, founder of modern epidemiology, I think is how you pronounce that. Specifically, John Snow was living in London when there was a cholera outbreak, and he had gobs and gobs of data. In other words, there was a lot of stuff he could look at. And a lot of other people looked at it as well, trying to understand what was happening. There were some people that were arguing, well, what was happening was people were walking through cemeteries, and they were getting some kind of cemetery air that would murder them, and that's how they got cholera. Others thought it was all kinds of variety of things. But this data was just sitting there, but no one could really see it. It was just, imagine Excel spreadsheets of deaths. Along comes John Snow, and he has this theory that, hey, I think cholera is being spread by things called germs, etc., etc., etc. Now, what level of granularity this guy understood all that, I couldn't tell you. That doesn't really matter for the story. But what matters is that the data was being collected, and it wasn't until Snow actually bothered to look at it and then try to see it in a different way that there was insight. So the specific way that he saw it was that he took the data and he mapped it. And you can see these little, this is a street, obviously, and the little black rectangles are not buildings. They're the total number of deaths at that given address. So let's zoom in on one particular area. You can see here that there's some houses that have tons of death. And then as we move out of that area, it decreases. Now, there are actually a handful of different things that are outliers in this graph. So, for instance, there's a prison on this graph that had relatively few deaths at the prison. That's actually pretty close to the epicenter of everything. Or there's a whole little block of houses located along the right edge where there weren't that many deaths at all relative to their neighbors. Why is that? Well, it turns out that all of these outliers, as well as the trend, can be explained in one thing, and that is this dot right in the middle of the map is a water pump. And everyone was going to the water pump and using it, and they would get infected, meaning the water pump was the epicenter of the cholera outbreak. So what's up with the prison, and what's up with the one neighborhood that didn't have that problem? It was really simple. The prison has its own water pump, and so no one in the prison was drinking that water. And the neighborhood, those were all people that worked at the brewery. And part of the deal of the local brewery was that they would pay you less, but you would get to take home a ton of beer to be served to your family. And so they weren't drinking water, they were all drunk off beer. And because of that, they survived. And so Snow proved that by simply looking at the data and then seeing what it really had to say, he imagined what was happening. Cholera is tied to this specific water pump. He showed it then to the decision makers who had a variety of different people trying to lobby to try to prevent this cholera outbreak using their pet theory. But Snow's map convinced the powers that be to shut off the water pump. They simply removed the handle from the water pump, and within a handful of weeks, the cholera outbreak had stopped. So, that's insight. John Snow's insight from the data. He has an aha moment that's caused by actually looking at what's in front of him instead of just simply seeing it. So once we have the data, how do we actually gain insight? A great way I like to think about these insights is these 6 categories. Who, what, how many, where, when, how, and why. Who are the users? And what are they doing? Or what are the users? How many of them? Where are they coming from geographically, or where are they going inside of our tool? When are they using it? Does that change how we need to design this product? How are they using it? Are they using it in the pattern that we expect them to? And then the underlying hardest question to ask, why are people behaving the way that they're behaving, and how can we impact that? So let's get out of the historical realm for a little bit and look at some real life examples. So I used to work for a company called Applia, and Applia is a homework solution for higher ed. Incredibly successful homework solution, I should add. A lot of these homework solutions that exist out there actually don't move the needle very much for how students perform. But Applia had a huge improvement whenever it was studied, and had a huge cult following of instructors, which then correlated to a huge number of dollars for the company that I worked for. And so the question is, okay, if everybody else out there that we were competing with was making a homework solution, what made ours special? Was ours better designed? Not really. Was ours better written? No. Did we have a better sales force? No. What made ours better? What made ours better was that we really invested in measurement and analysis. We really invested at both capturing the data, looking at it, and then seeing it, analysis, trying to gain insight. And we tracked as much as we possibly could around every interaction the user had, no matter where they came from, and looked at their performance over time and tried to improve it, and used that insight to improve our product. So for instance, we would have homework. And at first, our homework, if you got it wrong, we would have a little teeny box that popped up underneath the homework. And that little tiny box, if you clicked on it, would expand. And when you expanded it, would kind of give you remediation. Say, hey, okay, you don't understand supply and demand. Let me just reiterate what supply and demand is. Now, we had a whole team of people that their job, these were subject matter experts, super smart people. And they were individually paired with editors and paired with technologists. And this little team of 3 would write all of this homework. And this homework was specifically crafted so it could be randomized so that they would get different problems every time they came, but each iteration would be asking a slightly different question. And not only would these experts work on writing the homework, they also wrote all that remediation. They spent a ton of time writing that remediation. In fact, when I would talk to them and say, it was about 75% of their time and energy went into crafting that remediation, because that was where learning would happen. And we wanted to help students as much as possible in that learning. The problem was, when we measured and analyzed, no one read it. No one read the stupid remediation. I should take that back. Actually, the people that read the remediation were the students that didn't need it. The high-performing students, the students that did great on all of their tests and did great on all of their homework, if they missed a single question out of 100, they would read the remediation. But the kids that actually needed the help, they wouldn't. And so we started asking ourselves, what can we do about this? This is a big problem. We've invested all this energy into writing this special content to help students that are struggling. And we know that our product sells more when professors see results in their students. And we intuit that probably if you're not doing well in a class, if you were to read some of our content, you might do better. So how do we encourage them to read more? It's really stupid what we did, but it worked. We just got rid of the button that you had to click to expand to see the remediation. And by doing so, when you hit grade this problem, it would push down the next button, the button that would go to the next page, and put all the remediation between the problem that you failed on and the button go to the next page. So you had to scroll past the remediation. Now we just figured, hey, if we just force you to see it, maybe they'll read it. And you know what we saw? We were able to measure time on task. And so we saw that actually most students, especially the ones that missed it, spent a lot more time reading the remediation problems. And you know what? It also drove incredible improvement in student performance. That one thing, by simply changing the button, dramatically improved hundreds of thousands of students that were studying our material and dramatically increased the perceived value of our product among our target audience. So we had this homework and we want to improve it. Well, what's another thing we can improve it? Well, I worked for a textbook company, so of course they have a textbook platform. And this is back before iPads and Kindles and ebooks and all that kind of stuff. And so what we wanted to do was, well, we need to create a textbook platform to integrate with the homework. So we looked around and we found this one. Now, it's not very pretty, but it did a pretty good job. If you looked at all of our performance metrics of how students used it and how they perceived it, it was relatively positive. It was also relatively lightweight. We had a pretty simple process to create stuff. We actually had many competing textbook platforms within this one textbook company. This is the one we settled on. It didn't match our aesthetic at all, and it never really been properly measured and analyzed. So we got to work and started doing user research like we've talked about before, and these are some of my notes from that time. We also started looking at data, specifically looking for insight. And so started asking questions like, who, what, how many, where, when, how, why? Who are these students that are accessing our material? How many of them in a given semester access how many times? Where are they physically located when they're accessing our material? Are they in a Starbucks? Are they in an apartment? Are they in a library? Also, where do they go? Do they just simply go page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4? We kind of assume that they do because that's how people read books, but are they actually doing that? When are they accessing our material? Are they studying at 3 in the morning or are they studying at 3 in the afternoon? How are they accessing our material? Are they getting in through some portal on the school site or are they logging directly in? And really, why? What's their goal? Does every single student want an A or is a C okay for many students? And we did a ton of this analysis, looking at the data, doing a user research, watching, okay, this number of students come in through this page, and then they go to this page, and then let's go to this page, and then they go to this page, etc., 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 by digging through our logs and graphing stuff wherever it was too much for us to just perceive just by looking at the numbers. And we came to a conclusion, one that was actually relatively shocking within our industry, and that is that students are scanners, skimmers, and doers, not readers. We assumed they were reading a textbook, meaning page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. That assumption was dead wrong. Almost no students did that. Instead, what they would do is scan over every single page very quickly, or go into individual page and skim it quickly, but skim the entirety of it rather than just water skiing over the surface of the lake like a scanner does. Or be doers. They would start with their homework, and when they encountered a problem they didn't understand, then they would get into the book. But they're not readers. In fact, almost none of them were readers. It was within a rounding error of 0, the total number of readers of a given chapter. And so that data that we dug into led to that insight, which led to this solution. We redesigned that first thing that you saw to look like this, where along the top of the page, you could click this little button that said Read Textbook, and it would expand to this, what we called the flip book. And it was almost like the album view in old school iTunes, where you could scroll across horizontally, and each one of those pages would like flip in front of you, so you could quickly scan it. And if you had read the page, you might remember certain graphics being on certain pages and go into that. Also, if you would roll over each one of these individual pages, keywords and concepts would appear over top of it to tell you inside of this page is a definition of supply and demand, or what have you. And then individual pages were redesigned to be more visual so that when they're scanning and skimming, they can quickly find the material they're looking for. We also saw in our research that a lot of students highlight physical books. But we look at our digital books, we had a variety of platforms of them at the company that I worked for, and saw that almost no one actually highlighted in a digital book. So the conclusion of everyone that I had talked to up until that point was always, oh, students don't highlight books. In which case, I would then turn around and say, you're crazy. They highlight books all the time. Go to any used bookstore and you're going to see highlights everywhere. In fact, we talked to a bunch of students, again, data, and then Kabelamo, insight, that they actually bought used books based on the highlights. They were looking for highlights. So if highlights matter so much in the physical world, why wouldn't it work in the digital world? And the insight was pretty simple. Highlighting in the digital world wasn't as easy in the physical world. In the physical world, I just grab a highlighter, rub it over some paper, and I got something highlighted. We looked at all the platforms that we worked for and that we owned, and they were all bonkers how they highlighted. Some would you toggle the entire paragraph and highlight an entire paragraph. But when we looked at physical books, no one was highlighting entire paragraphs. They were highlighting words, phrases, and sentences. And so that level of granularity wasn't going to work. We had another platform that allowed you to highlight all the way down to individual characters. How it worked is you would press a little button that said annotations, as if any student in the world knows what that means. You press that little button, it would expand a little palette, and one of the things you could annotate with was a highlighter. You click on a highlighter, and then it would ask you what color you want to highlight in. You choose the color, and then you could click and drag over the text that you wanted to highlight. And then when you were done, you'd release your mouse and have to go back and click on the little highlighter to put it away up on the palette, and then the palette would tuck away. Okay, you can highlight granularity at a high level of granularity, but imagine what that means to a student in real life. If they had to do that with a real highlighter, that's the equivalent of keeping the highlighter zipped up in your backpack, and whenever you want to highlight, you gotta go unzip your backpack, root around for some stuff, grab the color that you want, take off the cap, and drag it across the paper. Then put the cap back on, put it back in your bag, and zip your bag back up. No one wants to do that. It's crazy. So instead what we did was we came up with this. You simply select a text as if you're going to copy and paste it. And immediately right next to your mouse will appear this little highlighter button. This little highlighter button was just one color, yellow. Why? Because we went and we got a bunch of used books and all the highlights were yellow. No one cares about multiple colors. The high-performing students, those kids that we actually really didn't need to help because they were doing fine, they use different colors to mean different things. But most students, yellow was all it was. So we don't need a whole bunch of options. Yellow is good enough. So you click that little highlighter button, and it'll highlight the text that you have. You roll over it again, and it appears this little X button that would remove the highlight. That's just a way to get rid of it. Hey, that's a value add over physical. You can't erase a highlight in the real world. And then what we'll do is we looked at students. How are they using their highlights? In real world, they flip through the pages looking at their highlights and just reading their highlights. Well, hey, this is a digital world. That content doesn't just have to exist in that one place. We can pull it out. And so at the end of every chapter, we would pull out every single highlight that the student have, along with a button to view in full context, which allowed to see the entire paragraph of where the highlight was. And then if they clicked on the paragraph, they could go back to the page where they was. And you know what that meant? That meant in dramatically improved usage of highlighting, dramatically improved usage of e-readers. At the time, if you did any kind of survey around ebooks, every student hated them. Hated them. They never used them. They would pay way more money for a physical book. We turned it around. This product dramatically improved users' perception of ebooks. And you can see here, it improved learning. How do we get that? We got that by simply looking at the data, seeing it, and getting insight, and then proposing solutions. You know, there's an uphill battle to build that product. There was a lot of people that had entrenched views on how learning should occur and how books should occur. We had a lot of people that told us, no, I don't want you to build this flip book thing. I want students to be forced to read page 1, page 2, page 3. Well, look, man, I get it. You want them to be good people that read page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, but they're not. And instead, why don't we just enable them to do what they're doing, but do it more efficiently and make sure that they're learning. So who cares if they read page 1 to page 2, page 3, page 4? They're learning the material. That's what matters. And so we encountered all kinds of uphill battles. Another one that we encountered was page numbers. Everyone told us at the time we had to have page numbers in our digital book, which is bonkers. Makes no sense. Why would you have page numbers? Page numbers are determined by how much ink you can fit on a dead tree inside of a book. It makes no sense to include page numbers. Instead, each page in our platform was built on content. So like a header would be its own page, a subhead would be another page, etc., instead of what physically fit. Well, I got a lot of pushback on that. And so I met with a lot of people where I'm arguing on my side of the pendulum and they're arguing on their side of the pendulum. Eventually, there were a lot more of them than me. And so how do I win? I win simply by they all had opinion, but I had data. Not that much, but enough that shifted the whole thing so that I could win the argument. And so instead of saying, let's go ahead and build in a function that would allow us to include physical page numbers, which when you think about it, is way more complicated than it sounds, because that means all of our content needs to be tagged so we have an indicator as to where the page number is. We have to design some kind of weird system that indicates to the student where a page number is. What do you do when in a physical book, a figure probably should belong on page 2 because that's where the text is talking about it, but it doesn't fit on page 2 because it has to fall on page 3. Well, then where do you put the figure if it belongs next to the text talking about figure 2, but because of the page break, it has to fall someplace else? Where do you put that figure? It's a ton of problems. Simply the request of put in page numbers is simple, but it's really complex. So what did we do? We went back to the data, and we started asking people and looking at how do people use it. We saw students didn't care about page numbers at all. Who was asking for page numbers to our sales force? It wasn't students, it was professors. And so why were they asking for page numbers? Very simple. Everybody thought they needed page numbers. They didn't need page numbers. They needed a better map, because what professors were doing was they were taking their syllabus from the previous semester and just doing copy paste, and that's the new semester. And in that syllabus, last semester they used a physical book and they told students to read pages 54 through 76 or whatever. Heck, that just happens to correlate to chapter 4. So instead of having page numbers, we just simply amped up our customer support service, and our customer support people would simply add textbook readings, chapter 2 links based on the syllabus. The professor would email a PDF to the technical support people, and they would manually translate the syllabus into a virtual syllabus, a map, that would then map to the content. This saved us a ton of money, a ton of development resources, and our sales and our support people, we actually built some tools to make this fast for them. It took them barely any time. And you know what? Professors loved it because they thought they were getting this one-on-one, curated experience and all that kind of stuff. But really, it was crazy cheap, super easy, and saved us gobs and gobs of money and made a better product for everyone. I like to say, after that experience, that data is kind of like bringing a gun to a knife fight. If you just have a little bit of data, you can get a little bit more insight than everyone else's opinion in the room, and then you can make way better products. So, let's say we're collecting tons of data. We know where users are coming from, we know who they are, and all that kind of stuff. How do we actually dive into insights about them? Specifically, how do we look at the digital data, this traffic footprint, which I like to call is like a digital patina, like a leather bag or whatever, that as you use it, it gets kind of worn in certain areas and you can see, oh, that's where the person always puts this. And how much cooler is a leather bag that has tons of patina than one that doesn't? It's way cooler. Like, Indiana Jones is way cooler because all of his stuff is all worn down. Well, another example of patina would be like, I'm sure if any of you are wearing jeans, if you look at your pockets, on the outside of your jeans, you can see where your phone is because over time it has worn into that area. This is where I put my phone. All right, so it's like we have this digital patina. How do we use that to gain insight? So let's look at the who's, the what's, the how many's, the where's, the when's, the how's, and the why's. So let's start with the who. In Crossroads, we talk about who's is coming around as being along this continuum. And this continuum is very simple. It starts out with sleepers, people that don't even realize that they want to be involved in a spiritual community at all. And then, over time, they become seekers, people that are looking for something. They might try out a variety of churches, a variety of belief systems, or read a variety of books. Eventually, they become receivers that say, you know what, this particular flavor of religion called Crossroads I like, and so I want to become involved in this thing, but I'm just going to simply receive what you have on a given Sunday and to consume it. And eventually they start applying that and they start making hard choices about their lives and they become followers. And then hopefully over time they're not just simply following, making hard decisions that align with what they've been receiving, which aligned with what they had sought, which aligned with having been awoken, but they also become producers, people that build into other people, or people that start to do more and make rather than just consume. And so the question that you could be asking when you think about your products, goods, and services that are digital is that, okay, if those are the who's, and there might be a variety of other who's that you have, but if those are the who's that we have coming, what are the different types of things that those different who's need? And what are the different places they get hung up? And how do they behave? When we watch the digital patina that emerges, it's not just a bunch of random people walking around. These people can kind of fall into different demographics. And how can we help those people to move along this continuum so they can become a better version of themselves? Or we can ask questions about how many. There's a lot of different types of how many questions we could ask. For instance, we could ask, okay, how many of our videos are being viewed? Well, there's a question below the question of how many of our videos are being viewed. For instance, if there's one person that's watching 100 videos in a given week, that's very different than 100 people watching one video. Or let's take it a step further. Let's say instead of 100 people each watching different videos, just one of them, what if all 100 people were all watching the same video? Think about how much more insight you would get out of those different answers. One would say, hey, there are some people that are consuming a ton of our stuff. Maybe we need to build products that help them consume things in a way that makes sense for them. Or maybe they're consuming a ton of stuff, but they haven't found what they're actually looking for. And so we need to build a product, good, or service or system that kind of recommends and curates content based on what their interests are. Or let's go to the next group, which is there's a bunch of people watching a bunch of different random videos. Okay, then some randomization thing needs to be built. Or all those different people, are they really all watching random videos? And how long are they watching for? Are they watching the entire thing or just little snippets? Or our example of 100 people all watching one video. Oh man, that's insightful, because that'll tell us, hey, there's a lot of people that are interested in this topic. Maybe we need to build some more stuff around that topic. Next is where. Not just where are people physically located, but where are they moving through our site? There's this really interesting concept in design called desire paths. Desire paths are really simple. Imagine that you had a building and maybe a little water sprinkler. And before you put down any sidewalk between these buildings, you just paved it over with grass rather than pavement. And you had a bunch of grass there. And you just let it go for a year. And over time, you would see different paths carved into the grass, different dirt spots where people are always walking. That's what we call a desire path. And then a good designer leaves lots of open room for desire paths to emerge, and then circles back, and then you put down the sidewalk. That way you know this is where people want to go. Digitally, we can do the same thing. We can do heat maps on sites that allow us to see, okay, this is where gaze is happening. This can be done in a variety of different ways. We have some tools here in Miami that let you use to track user pupils as they're engaging with digital content. So you can actually see what they're looking at. And then if you run enough users through, you can build these heat maps. So let's see, oh, everyone looks in that big, bright red spot and no one looks in the white spot. Hey, we have all of our buy buttons or give buttons or play buttons all in the white spot. That's a bad idea. Maybe that's why no one's using our thing and no one's completing what we want them to complete because they're not looking at it. Okay, or there's other ones that aren't quite as accurate, but still pretty useful over the gaze stuff where it just tracks mouse cursor. You can see where people move their mice over time. That's all where, but also where geographically. This is a tool that was built into MLS system. If any of you bought a house ever, you know about the MLS. This is a system that allows you to see things like crime overlaid on a map. Or imagine this. This is by the New York Times a couple of years ago, after the Obama and Romney duke 'em out. You can see that, hey, this is how the different states went down. Now that's interesting, but then what gets really cool about where is when you start looking at higher levels of fidelity and granularity. So for instance, let's look at Ohio. You can say Ohio turned red or blue in this election. But when you actually look at a county-by-county basis, that tells you a lot more about the makeup of Ohio. There's a lot of insight and aha by that higher level of fidelity. Or let's look at when. When are people using our site? Back when I worked at Applia, we would look at when as to what time of day are people studying. And maybe we should adjust colors. We never actually did, but we considered adjusting colors based on when. So that, hey, if you're nighttime, we'll give you a dark screen so it doesn't burn your retinas at night. Or we could see students are cramming right before an exam. And so that when was actually really insightful because we could then inform instructors, hey, the night before an exam, everybody's studying this. Are you sure that's what you want them to be studying? Or when. We could use that to predict all kinds of things like usage patterns and how hard our servers are going to hit because we saw that there was a huge uptick on Fridays and Saturdays of usage, but a huge drop on Sundays and Mondays of usage. That had a really big impact. That allowed us to properly staff our technical support department, for instance, by looking at when. Or let's look at when on a map that we'll call a calendar. And you can then start to look at heat maps of the calendar and see, oh, this type of content gets consumed in a given month or on a given day, or behavior patterns happen in this way, or certain calls to action are mentioned on a Sunday. Are those followed through on the week following? And then maybe we send out an email that says, hey, remember we mentioned this camp? Here's a link to sign up. Well, that could go out on a Wednesday. And by heat mapping out onto a calendar, you can start to see when certain behaviors are triggered. And you can start to answer the question, is it more useful to send emails? Is it more useful to mention stuff from on stage? Is it more useful to do these big social media pushes? Is it more useful to do a variety of things? By looking at when, you can see when are things happening and correlate that to certain actions that would trigger that. Or how. How are people getting to our content? Are they coming through our homepage? Are they coming through search results off of Google? Are they coming to individual videos because of social media posts? How are people getting there? These how questions are actually super, super insightful and super, super useful. We often think that Amazon looks like this. But if you actually look at the how usage of Amazon, Amazon for most people does not look like this, the homepage. Amazon for most people looks like this, the product page. This was an insight that Amazon wrote up a while ago, which was basically, hey, we just realized no one comes to our homepage. No one goes to Amazon.com. what they do is they go to Google and search for Kind bars or whatever, and they follow the link into the product page. And so this is actually our front page. And so all of our energy needs to be spent around optimizing the design of this, because this is actually the first page. The how really matters. Or imagine if you were to look at the how of how people get into Crossroads content. Are they coming from social media? Are they coming through the homepage? Are they coming through emails that we blasted out? How are they getting to individual content? Then you start doing things like combining hows with whos, and you start getting some really interesting questions that can be answered. So for instance, if this is a who, a person that's never been to our page, and they come to a video through a link that one of their friends shared, how long are they watching that video? That's an interesting question, because if they're coming and watching the entire thing, that means something very different than if they're watching the first 2 minutes. Because if it means that they're watching the first 2 minutes, maybe we should chunk up our videos into be small little bite-sized bits. And that might actually inform teaching, so that Brian teaches slightly differently, so his sermons can be broken up into smaller bites, so that the small little bite-sized chunks can be served on social media, so that the who's that are coming, people that never checked out Crossroads before, actually get some real meat and potatoes versus sitting through some introductory story. You see how hows combined with whos can really dramatically change a lot of different things, besides just simply optimizing a website, all the way out to changing how Brian teaches. Or let's look at some other hows. So this is a great example of A/B testing. I think A/B testing is the secret sauce of this stuff, really. The ability to A/B testing is simply this. We're going to show half of our users design A, and half our design of our design to users B, or half of our users design B, and we'll see how they perform. Do more users follow certain paths in A, or do they follow certain paths in B? This company is currently called Basecamp, but was originally called 37 Signals, used to post their insight from A/B testing. And here's one. On the left-hand side, you can see the original design of their website, and then what they call their long-form design on the right-hand side. There was a 37% increase in signups just from the long-form design. That's huge. Think about how many millions of dollars that is for folks like this. So then they decided to optimize their long-form design. And so they took their original design and they said, hey, this long-form thing really works. Maybe we can make the long-form even better. And so they compared their original design with this, which is a human-centric design. And they saw 102.5% increase in signups with just the picture of the person versus the thing on the left, which is crazy, huge change. Well, then you start to ask the question, okay, well, the one on the right has a lot less text than the one on the left. You get a lot less questions answered than the one on the right. So maybe what they need to do is take the one on the right and add some text underneath it. Well, you know what happened? The one on the right actually saw a decrease in usage by 22.7%. 23% of less users signed up when there was more stuff to read. So you'd think you're designing stuff to inform people, but actually had a huge decrease in engagement. You actually undercut yourself by that. Okay, let's do an A/B test. What happens if we don't have that gal and her quote? What if we have a different user and their quote? And so they went out and they found a bunch of other users and put in their quotes, and they saw things like this, which is basically the person doesn't really matter that much in their A/B tests. It's really things like this, the big content changes, making it simpler for users. And last but not least, why? Why are people behaving the way they're behaving? And it really comes back to mind melding with them, really trying to understand who our users are. If we start with data, that's useful. If we look at it, that's great. If we see it, that's what really matters. But it's a synthesis of those things that produces insight that then lets us create better products out of better problems. And that's how insights fit into data and solutions, which can then fit into measure and analysis. And that's how we can evolve our products over time to make them better and better and better. Because really the design process is not a linear thing, it's a circular thing. And we start with a problem and we work our way all the way through our prototype, and then we test it like crazy and we measure and analyze those results, and those produce new problems, which then we circle back to the beginning in a giant spiral, constantly rethinking our whole product, not just the one little bit that we're involved in, but the whole thing. And that's how measure and analysis can fit into whole product thinking. All right, guys, this, along with a bunch of other resources I posted on my website here, feel free to check them out. As you guys move into this upcoming sprint, I think it's going to be great. I think it's going to be insightful, but you're going to be diving into a variety of different ways of measuring and analyzing existing stuff. I just hope that you have a ton of fun and that you come up with some really, really amazing stuff as you measure and analyze and think about whole product thinking and think about the whole thing rather than just the individual blips.